life, on people, and how we can solve certain problems, how we should approach. So it was quite fruitful conversation. Well, he's a chemist and conducting research in chemistry and biochemistry, and he's a assistant professor in Clark University and science advisor to U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA. He was a postdoctoral student at the lab of Professor Lucy from September 79 to August 80, where he says one of the best years in his life. He got in Zurich, professor, which is lab. But most importantly, he's a proud and loving father, a son of a daughter-in-law and 3 beautiful grandchildren. And even he talks about them, I mean, his eyes were glaring, and so I have to show the picture together, and we all have to share the love that he has to them. And he's a vegetarian, but not only for the health purposes, but also his deep concern about the environment and about the future. We are going to actually. At a point in his life, he considered to be a Catholic priest. Then he changed his mind about the Catholic Church, and he got into the path where he led him to where he is now. When I asked him what makes him going on, and he said like using his mind, and that is what makes him get up in the morning and like go and like push till the end, as I understood. He believes in peace and tolerance, and he deeply believes that the children or the young people, next generations, will solve our deep problems, problems we are facing today. And he was very passionate about this, and actually, which I really liked. He values the importance of play, so not only work or serious, but he very much values the importance of play with especially his grandchildren, but in general he thinks playing should be in our lives to open us up in many ways. And he believes there are 2 kinds of people in the world. The ones who respond the same way when they get hurt, and the ones who try not to hurt under any circumstances. He really likes the idea, believes in the idea that the God is woman, which I hope it's true. And there are 3 books that's actually 3 of the most influential or most important books he read in his life. Life Lessons by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and The Soledad Brother by George Jackson, and How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, which I think he used some of the techniques on me yesterday. Today he's going to present on system thinkings in medicine and new drug discovery. But before he starts his talk, there's a slight glimpse a small introduction that we came to the conclusion yesterday. So certainty is ignorance. Thank you very much. I leave this.
For letting me work in your lab. It has made such a difference in my life and my career, and thank you for inviting me. So, and while we are doing this, let me apologize to the younger generation for the terrible things we have done to the environment with my generation. Please forgive us as we work with you to try to correct some of these terrible things we have done. So, to learn about something, oftentimes it's important to also look at its opposite. So I will compare and contrast systems thinking and reductionist thinking, and then spend the rest of my talk focusing on systems thinking. Luigi did cover some of these things like emergent properties and autopoiesis, so I will not spend a lot of time on this, but I want to spend a lot of time on themed ecology and especially total quality management, or TQM. Those of you who are still students, when you interview for a job, if you can tell the person interviewing you that yes, you understand total quality management, that might help you get that job. But more important, systems medicine is all about predicting your susceptibility to a disease so that you can have the proper lifestyle and behavior to prevent that disease. And it is personalized, and it is participatory. That is, it encourages the very natural tendency for a person and their caregiver to participate in their own health and health care. So the two paradigms, reductionist thinking and systems thinking, can be contrasted, where reductionist thinking, the whole is equal to the sum of its parts, as opposed to the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So systems thinking encourages the concept of synergy. Before total quality management, when reductionist thinking worked, you look for a single root cause of a problem. If you could identify the one gene that caused the disease, then you could cure the disease. Where in systems thinking, we realize that complex problems have many interacting causes, and more importantly, the person or thing that causes the problem is the one most capable of solving it. Just think of Saul and St. Paul, for example. You expect linear behavior in reductionist thinking, where you expect and look for nonlinear behavior in systems thinking. In systems thinking, we recognize life's many rhythms, similar to the polyrhythms in Cuban music. We also reject dogma and reject racism. I would point out that this is white, not this. But it would be dogmatic to reject all of dogma. So happiness is good for all of you. Okay? We also look for nature, for medicines and ways to prevent diseases, but again, it is not a dogma. One of the most important medicines is glucophage, that is used to treat diabetes, but also seems to be able to increase people's lifespan, or more importantly, their health span, or the number of years that they can remain healthy. So, in terms of medicine and biology, in the reductionist way of thinking, genes are in control of everything, and genes determine our race. And the human genome is considered to be the blueprint of life. Like a blueprint, it is fixed, and it predicts everything in a human. There were even popular movies called Jurassic Park, where supposedly you could create an entire dinosaur if you only had the dinosaur's DNA. And it also said that only about 2% of our DNA is transcribed into messenger RNA, which is translated into proteins, and the other 98% is just junk. It also says that proteins provide structure and are the machinery of life, in the machine metaphor of life, and it says that one gene codes for one protein, and again, you look for the root cause in reductionist thinking, so diseases are caused by a single defective gene or protein. In systems thinking, we just turn this around. It is not a blueprint, but it is highly dynamic, where pieces of DNA can move around and have different functions in different cells. And the approximately 23,000 protein-coding genes code for millions of proteins, not 23,000 proteins. And about 76% of our DNA is transcribed into other types of RNA that then regulate the transcription of the DNA and how the proteins are translated and how they are used in epigenetics. There are also mobile DNA elements where pieces of DNA can actually jump around. And also ancient viral DNA sequences help distinguish our brains from other primates. So even though viruses are not alive, according to the theory of autopoiesis, they are certainly essential for life. So in contrast to what you just saw previously about the reductionist thinking, we are in control, and I strongly recommend this book, The Music of Life. It talks about life's many polyrhythms. And they are in all of us, and they are totally dependent upon the great joy that we have in making love with each other and spreading them. So we are in charge, not our genes. And to criticize a little bit the idea of dogma, I have read many articles about development that say that development in all organisms is irreversible. And I was even at a memorial service for a dear friend where a rabbi quoted this section of the Bible that says that all forms of life. However, I do very much like the idea of the Catholic Church where the Bible is inspired. If God had tried to tell the person writing the Bible about viruses and bacteria, the person would have maybe thought God was just coughing or clearing his throat. It would have made no sense. So I refer you to the immortal jellyfish, which is tiny little 5-millimeter diameter that reverts to the sexually immature stage after becoming sexually mature. They make many copies of themselves. So if you express this in human terms, every polyp is its own mother, daughter, and sister. So what an identity crisis. So this is the beautiful picture of this wonderful organism that shows that aging is not necessarily is not our destiny. Also, I would say that the original bacterial cell could be 4 billion years old. Bacteria reproduce by binary fission, so if you anthropomorphize this, each cell is its own mother and daughter, or father and son. Again, what an identity crisis. And even though the original bacterium has changed extensively, supposedly all cells, including bacteria, can be traced back to that original cell. So some bacteria are 4 billion years old, even though they have gone through many changes. There is also a metaphor of the tree of life. And of course, it is a metaphor. Even those that use this metaphor realize that life started as a bacterium, not as a tree. And then we talk about these different branches, described more by this, but again, it is just a metaphor. Another metaphor that I prefer is the rhizome of life. Let me go back just a second. Throughout all of this, genes jump from bacteria into these different organisms, and all of these have viral DNA sequences. So even though viruses may not be alive, they are essential for life and they help make us human. Now I want to spend a little bit more time on systems ecology because it is quite consistent with systems thinking. The human body is an ecosystem with many interior ecosystems, the microbiome, where, for example, people before have been talking about the brain. And I just wondered, which brain are you talking about? This brain or this brain? Because we have a second brain in our gut that is our interior oncologist. By not eating meat, you can have a much healthier gut microbiome and increase your health span and your lifespan. By controlling your appetite and trying not to become obese, again, you can have a much healthier brain. But even that is a bit reductionist. We now talk not about the brain or the nervous system, but the neuroendocrine immune system. That is, this brain and this brain produces hormones. They are very important parts of our immune system. So really, when you talk about what might be in the brain, it's in the neuroendocrine immune system, which is everywhere, except maybe your hair, because if so, I'm losing my mind. Also, 4 years ago, when Luigi and Friedrich Kapper wrote their book, they kind of lamented how there really wasn't much being published on systems thinking in ecology. Happily, now that is changing. There's a Journal of Clean Air Production, and as we might imagine, the Chinese are leading in this. And they're very concerned about global climate change and the production of carbon dioxide. Also, I would point out and emphasize that in reductionist thinking, people try to force things that obviously are nonlinear into being linear. I remember a lecture maybe 20 years ago by a toxicologist who stomped his foot like he was a mule and said there is no safe dose of radiation. And when I looked this up on the internet, there are graphs like this that plot mortality versus the dose of radiation, and they just assumed that this was a straight line. Okay? So there are different models, which again can be somewhat dogmatic, but at the Food and Drug Administration, sometimes we do need to try to follow the law, and not the scientific law, but if something causes cancer, it is assumed that there is no safe dose of a carcinogen. If something does not cause cancer, then it's a threshold model where there is a safe dose, and only at a certain threshold does toxicity appear. And then there is a hormetic model where at low doses, and this might be just upside down where beneficial is here and harmful there. So at very low doses, you can have a beneficial effect, and at higher doses, you can have toxicity. A classic example of this is the metal called selenium. Before the 1970s, it was well known that if grass contained too much selenium, it could kill cows. So there were methods developed to analyze grass to determine the selenium concentration. And then when a better analytical technique came along, inductively coupled plasma spectroscopy, they found suddenly, actually, we can detect very low levels of selenium in the human body, and they found that actually there are some enzymes that absolutely require selenium. So when a mechanism can be shown, hormesis can be almost proven, but again, remember the dogma and the initial introduction that certainty is an enemy of wisdom. What we can say is that there's clear and convincing evidence to support a hypothesis, but we must remain open-minded and keep our humility and realize that the next generation might modify this. I would also add that science is about the process, not the destination. Every answer generates 10 new questions. This is a graph I just drew myself to kind of simulate the biological effects of drug dose, that at a very low dose, you might have no effect. At a higher dose, when you reach therapeutic dose, then you can see a physiological effect. But eventually, when you get too high of a dose, it becomes toxic. So this then leads me to the first rule of toxicology. All substances are toxic if given at too high of a dose to the wrong organ. For example, if you do a calculation, the most toxic substance is the electron. If you calculate how many femtograms of electrons it takes to electrocute a person, electrons are very toxic, but absolutely essential for life and for civilization. Perhaps the next most toxic substance is fresh air. One air bubble injected into the veins is deadly. Fresh water can also be quite toxic. My mother, God rest her soul, was a nurse, and she said the most common reason for young people to be admitted to an emergency room is in a sorority or fraternity initiation. They drank so much water that their electrolytes were depleted. So you might hear sugar is bad for you, salt is bad for you. That is dogmatic. You need some sugar and some salt in all of your cells to stay alive. So coming back to hormesis, you can have a beneficial dose sometimes with some toxic substance like selenium, and possibly even with low doses of radiation. However, each person might be different, so this is not dogmatic. Some things that might be toxic to one person might be helpful to another. And in pharmacology, I got this off of the internet that talks again about the same type of thing, that everything is toxic given at too high of a dose. Reductionist thinking is all about prediction. If you look at Newton's laws, if you know the position and momentum of a particle, you can predict its future position and momentum if you ignore friction and interaction with the environment. Where in systems thinking, almost nothing is predictable. And you look at the relationships between parts and whole new properties can emerge. And it's important to look for hidden connections. Sometimes the smallest little act of kindness can generate such wonderful love and feelings in the person that you give that kindness to. Also, we need more than just computers. We need philosophy and a human touch. Systems biology considers health and disease to be a continuum. And sometimes people like to compare different types of physicians. It is, I think, a little bit prejudicial, maybe dogmatic, to say specialists only look at test results. I really appreciate the conversations I had with Dr. Bruce that pointed out to me that all specialists start out in medical school as generalists, as general practitioners. And the truly excellent specialists remember that. Some of the specialties that have always been systems thinking medicine are the primary care physicians or general practitioners and those that are engaged in palliative medicine. They've always tried to communicate well with their patients, and they listen to the voice of their patients and help them achieve the goals that are meaningful to them. And yes, feelings are important. Perhaps one piece of dogma you can take with you is happiness is healthy. Happiness is the greatest thing there is. Okay? It is like a light in your heart, maybe said best in Brazilian Portuguese. Alegria é a melhor coisa que existe, é assim como a luz no coração. I think it sounds so much better in Portuguese. Then there are different types of omics. In the first slide I showed the human genome, which looks at the genes in our human eukaryotic cells, which are a tiny minority of the cells that we have. What is also important are all the different other types of omes, like the connectome that was shown the other day, how everything is connected with each other. Perhaps the most important one is the metabolome, part of which is the proteome, which tells not what happened in the past as you had your genes and your epigenetics, but it tells what is actually happening right now. So the metabolome can be used to predict what dose of medicine or which medicine should be used. And then once the treatment starts, when you look at the metabolites, you can see how the treatment is progressing and whether the dose should be changed or eliminated completely. Also, it's important to realize that evidence-based medicine is a bottom-up approach where the best evidence is combined with individual clinical expertise and patients' choices. So in evidence-based medicine, systems thinking is needed because they use not only their clinical experience and they make an effective diagnosis, but also consider what the patient and the caregiver need or want. Let me spend a minute talking about emergent properties, which Luigi mentioned briefly. They're due to relationships and the patterns of organization. As Luigi described in one of his previous points, even in mathematics, we can see this. For example, if someone is up there in an air balloon and says, where am I? If I only say, oh, you're in an air balloon, that is not very useful. But if I say you're in an air balloon and your destination is 100 kilometers that way, once you make a line segment or a point, that relationship, new properties emerge. Likewise, in 3 dimensions, new properties emerge. In 4 dimensions, where the 4th dimension is time, new properties emerge. One of the things I talk about in my book that I won't go into detail here is 3-dimensional printing and 4-dimensional printing, where you can print things that can be put into the human body and if put into a small child, as they grow, that device can change its shape to accommodate the child's growth. Perhaps the most, and also let me point out in chemistry how the hydrogen atom has very different properties than what I think is a mistake to call it a hydrogen ion. I prefer to call it a proton. Very different than a hydrogen ion. And then a hydrogen molecule like hydrogen gas, or hydrogen is part of water, or the hydrogens in a methyl, or a methylene, or a carboxylic acid have very different properties based upon their environment. Similarly, an oxygen atom is very different than a hydroxyl anion or reactive oxygen species. And my apologies to the biologists in the audience, chemists misuse the species. A hydroxyl ion and a hydrogen ion will not mate and produce fertile offspring. So they're not really a species. And life is the most important of the emergent properties. Also, ecology is totally consistent with systems thinking. The systems view of life is an ecological view, and it's grounded in a spiritual awareness. Connectedness, relationships, community are the pillars of both. Ecology comes from the Greek word oikos, or earth household. So ecology is the scientific study of the relationships between members of the earth household, and it is inherently multidisciplinary. And when doing multidisciplinary research, we almost have to become multilingual and tolerant of each other. During the break, I can maybe describe some examples of how physicists and biologists try to communicate about evolution. And we also look at the effects of human activity in ecology. In ecology, the basic unit is the ecosystem. There are multi-level structures, ecosystems nested within ecosystems. And biomes are regional communities of life extending over millions of square kilometers, and there are 8 of them total that you can read for yourself. And the systematic characteristics of life are listed here, and as Luigi said, it is autopoiesis, or self-making. There is an external membrane, so one can consider the biome, Mother Earth, or Gaia as being alive, where the outer membrane is the atmosphere, which is continually being broken down and being remade, and it is far from equilibrium. Equilibrium is synonymous with death, and being away from equilibrium is synonymous with life. And there are cognitive interactions with the environment. As Luigi pointed out, cellular life is global and it does not have any one center. And the organism creates its own world. When we look and perceive, we are bringing forth a world. I am paying attention to you and me. I'm not paying attention to a stupid little fly. Okay, I'm bringing forth my own world. So it interacts with the environment in the process of cognition. And each organism does engage in cognition. And it's a continuum concept for bacteria, amoeba, and all forms of life, including men and women. But the rhizome of life is kind of what I prefer as a metaphor over the tree of life, because DNA is a mosaic of genes. Only less than 1% of our genes are in the human cells that have 23 chromosomes. And so pieces of viral DNA and RNA are the sources of DNA that is reverse transcribed, or retrotransposons, that make our brains much different from other primates. And in philosophy, the rhizome allows for multiple non-hierarchical entry and exit